The final sound was the small, oiled click of the latch on her brother-in-law's door. It wasn't a slam, not an angry crash of wood against frame, but a quiet, mechanical finality that sealed one life and began another. Agnes stood on the narrow porch, her hand still raised as if to knock again, though she knew it was useless. Beside her, 10-year-old Hattie clutched a cloth sack containing her only doll and a spare pair of woolen socks, her small face pale and set. The air was already sharp with the promise of an early, hard winter, a promise that had hastened their eviction. A widow and her child were a burden, an extra mouth, a line in a ledger that no longer balanced. The arithmetic of survival was brutal, and they had been subtracted. Agnes lowered her hand and took Hattie's, her grip firm and steady, a silent promise that this was a step forward, not a fall. They walked away from the only home Hattie had ever known, not looking back. The town was a collection of sturdy, sensible buildings huddled against the vast, indifferent landscape of rock and pine. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, each plume a sign of a life she was no longer a part of. Her own resources were perilously small. In a worn leather pouch tied to her belt, beneath the heavy wool of her coat, were the coins she had saved from selling her lace and her husband's pocket watch. She could feel their cold, metallic weight against her hip, a constant, worrying reminder of their finite nature. She counted them in her head for the 10th time that morning, a grim accounting of their worth in this world. Enough for a room at the boarding house for a month, maybe 2. Enough for meager rations that would leave them weak and desperate when the real snows came. Or, perhaps, enough for something else entirely. A gamble. A different kind of arithmetic. One based not on slow subtraction but on desperate multiplication. Hattie's small steps faltered beside her. "Where are we going, Mama?" The question was a whisper, afraid to disturb the cold air. Agnes squeezed her hand. "We're going to find our own place, Hattie. A place no one can take from us." The words felt thin, brittle against the vastness of the sky, but they were the only tools she had at that moment. She had a plan, a desperate, half-formed thing born of sleepless nights listening to the wind and the resentful muttering from the other side of her wall. It was a foolish plan, a plan the town would mock, but it was hers. It was a seed of a future, and she would plant it in the hardest ground if she had to. They reached the edge of the small settlement, the last few houses giving way to the open, rising country. Here, the wind had a clearer run, and it bit at their faces, a taste of the long siege to come. Agnes paused and adjusted the thin blanket around Hattie's shoulders, her own worn coat a poor defense against the chill. The weight of the coin seemed to grow heavier with every step, a small, dense anchor of possibility in a sea of terrifying uncertainty. The land agent, Mr. Davies, looked at her over the top of his spectacles, his expression a practiced blend of professional sympathy and undisguised skepticism. His office was a small, warm room behind the general store, smelling of paper, pipe smoke, and dried goods. It was a bastion of order and commerce, a world away from the cold uncertainty Agnes now inhabited. She had laid her pouch of coins on his polished desk, the sound of the metal on the wood unnervingly loud in the quiet room. She told him what she wanted, the deed to the old quarry parcel, the one high up on the north ridge that everyone considered worthless. It was a patch of shattered rock and thin soil, abandoned decades ago, good for nothing. Mr. Davies pushed his glasses up his nose and sighed, a sound of profound weariness, as if her request was the latest in a long line of human follies he was forced to witness. "Agnes," he began, his voice softened with condescension, "that land is a tomb. Nothing grows there. It's windswept in the summer and buried in snow from October to May. There isn't even a standing tree on it worth felling for a cabin." He gestured vaguely towards the window, towards the distant, grim line of the ridge. "You and the girl would freeze before the first real storm. There's a room at the widow Johnson's boarding house. I can speak to her. You're a good worker. You could take in laundry, mending." He was offering her the sensible path, the path of slow diminishment, of dependence and quiet desperation. She would work her fingers raw for a pittance, living in a single, stuffy room, always at the mercy of a landlady's temper and a town's charity. She would be the poor widow Agnes, a fixture of communal pity. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "I'll take the land, Mr. Davies." He blinked, surprised by her quiet finality. "It's your money," he said with a shrug, his tone shifting from paternalistic to purely transactional. He drew up the deed, his pen scratching across the paper, the sound of her life-changing direction. The price was low, almost insultingly so, because the land was considered a liability. It left her with just enough. Not for comfort, not for security, but for tools. She walked from his office into the clatter and scent of the general store. Hattie stood by the door, a small, silent sentinel. Agnes did not look at the bolts of warm calico, the jars of penny candy, or the smoked hams hanging from the rafters. She walked directly to the back wall, where the tools of survival were displayed. A shovel, its wooden handle smooth and strong. A pickaxe, its steel head heavy and sharp. A length of good rope, a small hatchet, and 2 thick wool blankets, far heavier than their own. She bought sacks of beans and flour, a side of salt pork, and a large tin of lard. Every coin was spent with deliberation, a calculation of calories and utility. When she was done, the pouch was limp and nearly empty. Mr. Davies watched her purchases, his disapproval a palpable presence in the store. "You'll be back before the snow flies," he said, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. "There's no shame in it," Agnes simply nodded, hefting the pickaxe. Its weight was immense, solid, real. It felt more honest than any promise of a warm room in town. It was a tool for breaking things, but she intended to use it for building. She and Hattie divided the supplies, their belongings now consisting of what they could carry on their backs. As they stepped out of the store and into the biting wind, leaving the warmth and the smells and the pity behind, Agnes felt a strange sense of release. The decision was made. The gamble was on. She had traded the illusion of safety for the harsh reality of ownership. She owned a tomb, and now she had to find a way to make it live. The journey was an ascent into a harsher world. The path that led up to the North Ridge was not a proper trail but a faint track used by hunters, winding through dense thickets of pine and over fields of frost-hardened scree. Every step took them further from the town, which soon disappeared from view, swallowed by the rolling, grey-brown landscape. The weight of their packs was a constant, grinding burden. The shovel handle dug into Agnes's shoulder, and the pickaxe, strapped awkwardly to her pack, threw her off balance on the uneven ground. Hattie, burdened with a sack of flour and their blankets, trudged silently behind, her breathing a small, ragged counterpoint to the sighing of the wind in the pines. The world grew quieter as they climbed. The sounds of the town, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the barking of dogs, faded, replaced by the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the cry of a lone hawk circling high above. The air grew thinner, colder. They were stripping away the layers of civilization, of community, and entering a realm governed by older, more elemental laws. For 2 days they walked, stopping only for brief rests to chew on hard biscuits and drink from a cold, fast-running stream. At night, they huddled together under the new wool blankets, the ground leaching warmth from their bodies, the stars appearing as brilliant, icy chips in the vast, black sky. Agnes stayed awake long after Hattie had fallen into an exhausted sleep, listening. She was learning the language of this new place, the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof, the low hoot of an owl, the deep, resonant silence that separated the sounds. She was mapping the wilderness not with her eyes, but with her ears, acutely aware of their vulnerability. Hattie was brave, but Agnes could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. The world outside the familiar confines of the town was immense and intimidating. "Are we almost there, Mama?" she asked on the second afternoon, her voice small against the scale of the mountains. Agnes pointed towards a high, barren ridge, a spine of dark rock against the pale sky. "Up there. That's our place." The sight was not encouraging. It looked like the bleakest, most desolate spot in the entire range, a place the wind had scoured clean of all softness. As they made the final, grueling climb, the trees thinned and then disappeared entirely, leaving only stunted, hardy shrubs clinging to the cracks in the rock. The ground was a jumble of broken stones, the remnants of the old quarrying operations. It was a landscape of raw edges and sharp angles. Finally, breathless and aching, they stood on their property. It was exactly as Mr. Davies had described it, a windswept, barren shelf of rock. A tomb. A wave of despair, cold and sharp as the wind, washed over Agnes. For a moment, she felt the full, crushing weight of her foolishness. She had spent everything they had to bring her daughter to this godforsaken place to die. She saw the flicker of terror in Hattie's face and knew she could not let her own show. She forced her shoulders back and scanned the property, her gaze methodical, desperate, searching for any feature, any advantage she might have missed. There was nothing. It was here, in the perpetual shadow of the overhang, that the air felt different. The wind didn't gust and swirl, it seemed to die, and the cold was a different kind of cold, still, deep, and ancient. Patches of old, dirty ice clung to the rock crevices, shielded from the autumn sun. Agnes ran her hand along the stone. It was frigid, colder than the surrounding rock. Her gaze followed a dark, narrow crack near the base of the cliff, almost hidden by a tumble of fallen boulders. A faint, almost imperceptible draft of air flowed out of it, a current of profound cold that felt like the breath of the mountain itself. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she began to pull the smaller rocks away from the opening. Hattie, seeing her mother's focused energy, came to help, her small hand struggling with the sharp-edged stones. After 10 minutes of hard work, they had cleared an opening just large enough for Agnes to squeeze through. She lit the small lantern she'd carried, its flame flickering in the strange, outward-flowing draft. "Stay here," she told Hattie, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She slid into the fissure, her shoulders scraping against the rock, and found herself in a small, low-ceilinged chamber. The lantern light revealed walls of rock glazed with a thick, permanent layer of ice. The air was utterly still and so cold it stung her lungs. It was a natural ice cave, a pocket of deep winter trapped within the mountain. She moved deeper, the passage narrowing and then opening into a second, larger chamber. Here, the ice was even thicker, forming strange, beautiful, and intimidating formations that hung from the ceiling and rose from the floor. The cold was absolute. She held the lantern up, and its light was swallowed by the immense, frozen darkness. This was the hidden asset. This was the secret advantage. Mr. Davies had called the land a tomb, and in a way, he was right. But a tomb could also be a vault. A place to preserve things against the decay of the world outside. A place of perfect, unchanging cold. She backed out of the cave, her mind racing, the despair of moments ago replaced by a surge of fierce, calculated hope. She emerged into the grey afternoon light, blinking, her face flushed with discovery. Hattie looked at her, her eyes wide with questions. "Mama? What is it?" Agnes smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. "It's our larder, Hattie," she said, the words sounding grand and impossible. "It's our future." The plan, which had been a desperate prayer, now had a foundation of solid ice. The work would be immense, back-breaking, but it was no longer a vague struggle for survival. It was an engineering project. She looked at the pickaxe leaning against a rock. It was no longer just a tool for breaking stone. It was the key. The work began the next morning at dawn. The first swing of the pickaxe against the frozen earth outside the cave entrance sent a jarring shock up Agnes's arms. The ground was as hard as iron, a mix of rock and permafrost that yielded only grudgingly. Each strike produced a pathetic spray of tiny, sharp fragments. This was not the soft soil of a garden plot, this was a battle against the mountain itself. Her goal was to create a sunken, sheltered entryway to the cave, a buffer zone that would protect the entrance from wind and drifting snow. Beside this, she would dig their shelter, a dugout carved into the earth itself, using the cliff face as its back wall. It was a monumental task, one that would have daunted a team of strong men. For a woman and a child, it seemed impossible. But Agnes worked with a relentless, methodical rhythm. Swing, strike, pry. Swing, strike, pry. Her hands, soft from years of mending and lace-making, were soon blistered, then raw, then calloused. Her muscles screamed in protest, a deep, burning ache that never truly subsided. Hattie worked alongside her, her small face smudged with dirt, her expression serious. She couldn't swing the heavy pick, but she could use the shovel to scrape the loosened dirt and rock into a bucket, which she would then drag away and dump, slowly building a protective berm. They worked in a shared silence, their grunts of effort and the rhythmic scrape and clang of their tools the only sounds. Inside the cave, the work was different but no less difficult. The ice was too hard for the shovel, and the pickaxe was unwieldy in the tight confines. Agnes used the hatchet and a heavy rock as a mallet, painstakingly chipping away at the icy walls of the first chamber, widening it and carving out rough shelves directly into the frozen earth. The air was so cold that her breath plumed in thick white clouds, and the moisture froze instantly on her hair and eyebrows. It was grueling, finger-numbing labor, performed in the dim, wavering light of the lantern. The process was one of slow, incremental transformation. What was a narrow fissure became a proper entrance. What was a rough chamber became an organized space. Days blurred into a single, continuous cycle of labor, broken only by short, exhausted nights huddled in a temporary lean-to. They ate sparingly, their diet monotonous, beans and salt pork, cooked over a small, smoky fire. One afternoon, a section of the dugout wall collapsed, burying the shovel and undoing a full day's work. Hattie cried, a sound of pure frustration and exhaustion. Agnes, her face caked in mud, simply stared at the pile of earth for a long moment. Then, without a word, she picked up her bucket and began clearing the rubble by hand. There was no room for despair. Failure was just another problem to be solved. She learned to shore up the walls with carefully placed rocks, learning the crude engineering of survival through trial and error. Slowly, painstakingly, their world took shape. The dugout became a small, subterranean room, deep enough to stand in, with a roof of scavenged timber and sod. The sunken entryway to the ice cave was complete, with a heavy, insulated door Agnes fashioned from planks and packed with moss and earth. The cave itself was now a functioning cold store, its shelves awaiting their purpose. Agnes had broken the land, and in doing so, she had remade herself. With the primary construction finished, Agnes shifted her focus from excavation to accumulation. The dugout provided shelter, the cave provided storage, now they needed something to store. The system had to be built, piece by piece. She began hunting and foraging with a quiet intensity. She set snares for rabbits and grouse in the scrubland below the ridge, her movements patient and economical. When she was successful, she would skin and clean the animals with a practiced efficiency, Hattie watching and learning beside her. The best cuts of meat were wrapped in cloth and placed on the deepest shelves of the ice cave, where the cold was most profound. There, they froze solid within hours, perfectly preserved. The less desirable parts, along with foraged roots and hardy late-season greens, went into their stew pot for their immediate needs. Their life became a rhythm of maintenance and provisioning. Each morning began with checking the snares. The afternoons were for gathering firewood from the sparse tree line lower down the mountain, a laborious process of dragging deadfall up the steep slope. Evenings were for preparing food, mending their worn clothes by firelight, and planning the next day's tasks. The ice cave was the core of their entire operation, a silent, frozen heart that guaranteed their future. Agnes developed a sophisticated understanding of its properties. The innermost chamber was for deep freezing meat. The first, slightly less cold chamber, she designated for vegetables. She made a trip back towards the settled farmlands, a full day's walk each way, and traded the last of her husband's silver buttons for sacks of potatoes, carrots, onions, and turnips. She carried them back on her own tired shoulders, load by load. Each sack was carefully stored in the antechamber, the root vegetables nestled in beds of dry dirt she had hauled in, protecting them from the direct, freezing touch of the ice. She understood the need for redundancy. She smoked strips of grouse and rabbit meat, creating a supply of food that didn't rely solely on the cave. She rendered the fat from the salt pork and the game into lard, storing it in tins as a source of energy and a medium for cooking. Every action was deliberate, a step in building a resilient system that could withstand the coming siege of winter. She taught Hattie every part of it. How to read the weather in the clouds, how to bank a fire to make it last the night, how to identify edible plants, how to mend a tear in a coat with neat, strong stitches. These were not lessons in homemaking, they were lessons in survival. Hattie, in turn, became an integral part of the system. She maintained the small fire, she helped prepare the food, and she took on the responsibility of checking the cave's entrance each day, ensuring the insulated door was sealed tight against the outside air. Their small dugout, though crude, became a pocket of warmth and order against the encroaching chaos of winter. A fire burned in the small stone hearth Agnes had built, its smoke carried away by a cleverly concealed flue. Their 2 blankets, a few cooking pots, and their meager supplies were kept neat and organized. It was a fortress of routine, a defense against the vast, uncaring wilderness and the even more vast uncertainty of their future. Their isolation was not absolute. One crisp afternoon, a hunter named Frank, making his way along the high ridge in search of deer, stumbled upon their strange, burrowed home. He stopped, his rifle held loosely in his hand, and stared at the sight of Agnes splitting firewood with a hatchet, her face grim with determination. He saw the wisp of smoke curling from the sod roof of the dugout and the heavy, earth-banked door leading to the cave. His expression was one of pure astonishment, quickly followed by a deep, pitying sadness. He saw not a feat of engineering, but a desperate, pitiful last stand. He said, his voice gentle, as if speaking to someone who had lost their senses. "You can't mean to winter up here. You and the little one. This is no place for you." Agnes paused, resting the hatchet on the chopping block. She looked at his warm coat, his well-oiled rifle, his sturdy boots. He was a man of the town, a man who understood the world in a certain way, and she knew her reality was incomprehensible to him. "We're managing," she said, her tone polite but firm, offering no further explanation. Frank shook his head slowly, a look of profound sorrow on his face. "If you need anything," he began, letting the offer hang in the air. "We're managing," she repeated, and turned back to her work, the sharp crack of the hatchet splitting a log serving as a clear end to the conversation. Frank left, shaking his head, and the story of the mad widow of the ridge began to circulate in town. In Mr. Davies's store, around the heat of the pot-bellied stove, the men discussed her folly. "Digging her own grave, is what she's doing," one of them declared, packing his pipe. Frank said, "It's just a hole in the ground. She won't last till Christmas." Mr. Davies, who had sold her the land, felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, but it was quickly subsumed by the certainty of his own good judgment. "I told her," he said to the assembled men, his voice carrying the weight of unheeded wisdom. "I offered her a place. Some people just won't be helped." The town's pity was a comfortable, self-affirming thing. It solidified their own sense of security, their own wisdom in the face of a harsh world. They imagined Agnes and Hattie cold, hungry, and desperate, a tragic story waiting for its inevitable conclusion. They saw her through the lens of their own fears, never once suspecting that on her desolate patch of rock, the widow was not just surviving, she was building an empire of ice and foresight, a fortress of provisions that would soon make their own larders look pitifully bare. Her isolation became a shield, her secrecy a form of strength. The town's ridicule was just noise, as distant and meaningless as the wind that scoured the high peaks above her hidden home. The first snows came in late October, a light dusting that melted in the afternoon sun. But by mid-November, the storms began in earnest. They were no longer mere weather events, they were assaults. The wind howled over the ridge, a physical force that screamed and clawed at their small dugout. Snow fell not in gentle flakes but in blinding, horizontal sheets, piling into massive drifts that reshaped the landscape in a matter of hours. The world outside their shelter was erased, replaced by a churning, white chaos. For days at a time, they were prisoners in their small, subterranean space. The line between day and night blurred into a perpetual twilight, the only light coming from the fire and the single, small, covered window Agnes had built high in the wall. The sound of the blizzard was a constant, deafening roar, a reminder of the immense power trying to crush their tiny pocket of existence. Yet, inside, there was a profound and defiant calm. The dugout was warm, the stone hearth radiating a steady heat that kept the small space comfortable. The air smelled of wood smoke, stewing rabbit, and the earthy scent of the sod walls. While the storm raged, they lived by their established routines. They mended clothes, sharpened tools, and Hattie practiced her letters, scratching them onto a piece of slate with a shard of charcoal. The contrast was stark and deeply felt. Just beyond their door, a maelstrom capable of freezing a man solid in minutes. Inside, there was warmth, food, and order. Their trips to the ice cave became expeditions. Agnes would tie one end of her rope to the dugout's doorframe and the other around her waist, a lifeline against the blinding whiteout. She would fight her way through the wind and swirling snow to the heavy door of the larder, her body bent double against the gale. Inside the cave, the world changed instantly. The roar of the storm vanished, replaced by an absolute, cathedral-like silence. The air was perfectly still, the cold pure and clean. In the steady glow of her lantern, she would select what they needed, a frozen joint of rabbit, a few handfuls of carrots and onions, and then make the perilous journey back. These trips were a constant affirmation of her system. The storm could take the world, but it could not touch their food. The blizzard that began in the second week of December was different. It was a monster, a storm that the old-timers would later call the Great Blizzard of 1895. It came with an Arctic cold that sank its teeth into the very bones of the mountains. The snow was fine and hard as sand, and it fell without pause for a week. The town below was completely buried, cut off from the outside world and from itself. Houses became isolated islands in a sea of white. Supplies began to dwindle. Firewood became scarce. A quiet, gnawing fear took hold. Up on the ridge, Agnes and Hattie were secure. They had fuel, they had food, they had warmth. They were besieged, but their fortress was holding. The storm was the ultimate test of her design, and her system was proving flawless. She felt a grim, quiet pride. She had gambled everything on this place, and it had not failed her. On the 8th day of the Great Blizzard, the relentless wind finally paused, creating a deceptive, eerie silence. The world was a uniform, blinding white, the snow piled in drifts so high they buried fences and reached the eaves of houses in the town below. It was in this strange calm that a new sound reached Agnes, a weak, desperate shouting, nearly lost in the vast, muffled landscape. Peering through a tiny crack in her door, she saw a figure stumbling through the deep snow, a dark shape struggling against the immense white. The man was disoriented, exhausted, and collapsing. Without a moment's hesitation, Agnes pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf over her face, and plunged into the waist-deep snow, fighting her way towards the fallen figure. It was Dr. Miller, the town's physician. He was coated in ice, his face grey with cold and fatigue, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He had been trying to reach the Jensen homestead on the other side of the ridge, where 2 children were sick with fever, and had become lost in the whiteout. Agnes, with strength born of relentless labor, managed to drag him back to the dugout. He collapsed on the floor just inside the door, semi-conscious, muttering about the Jensen children. Hattie brought warm blankets while Agnes prepared a hot broth, forcing it between his cracked, blue lips. For hours, she tended to him, her movements calm and efficient, her small home transformed into an infirmary. As warmth and life slowly returned to him, Dr. Miller's eyes began to focus, taking in his surroundings with a dawning, profound confusion. He was in a small, warm, earth-walled room. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The air smelled of cooking food. He could not reconcile this impossible comfort with the frozen hell he had just escaped. "Where? What is this place?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're on the old quarry plot," Agnes said simply, ladling more broth into his bowl. The doctor stared at her. "The widow's place?" he asked, the town's dismissive nickname sounding absurd in this context. They said you were." He trailed off, unable to voice the town's grim predictions. Later, when he was stronger, he spoke of the town's plight. Supplies were dangerously low. The general store's reserves were nearly gone. People were burning furniture to stay warm. The fear was turning to desperation. "We have food," Agnes said, her voice quiet but clear. The doctor looked at her, at the small, tidy shelter, and assumed she meant a few days' worth of rations. "We all need to conserve what he started to say." Agnes stood up and lit her lantern. "Come," she said. She led him out into the sunken entryway and pulled open the heavy, insulated door to the ice cave. She held the lantern high. The light illuminated the first chamber. Dr. Miller fell silent. He saw the neat stacks of potatoes and turnips, the sacks of onions and carrots, all perfectly preserved. He saw the smoked meats hanging from pegs. Agnes then led him into the second, deeper chamber. The lantern light glinted off the frozen carcasses of dozens of rabbits and grouse, sides of venison she had traded for from a passing native hunter before the snows, and the remains of the salt pork, all stacked like firewood, a treasure hoard of frozen protein. Dr. Miller stood in stunned silence, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was standing in a vault filled with more preserved food than was left in the entire town combined. He looked from the incredible bounty back to the quiet, unassuming woman holding the lantern. "Good Lord," he whispered, the words a prayer of disbelief and awe. "What have you done here?" The tomb had become a fortress. The mad widow had become their only hope. The storm broke 2 days later. Dr. Miller, rested and fed, knew what he had to do. Agnes packed him a bundle of smoked meat and biscuits for the journey. "The snow is deep," she warned. "Stay on the high ground," he just nodded, his gaze filled with a new and profound respect. "Agnes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The journey back to town was an ordeal, but with a clear path and food in his belly, he made it. He went directly to Mr. Davies' store, which had become the town's grim command center. The room was cold, the stove barely giving off any heat, and the faces of the assembled men were pinched and anxious. Dr. Miller's arrival caused a stir, but it was his news that stunned them into silence. He didn't embellish. He simply told them what he had seen. He described the dugout, the warmth, and then he described the cave. "She has food," he said, his voice ringing with authority in the quiet room. "Enough to see this town through." More than enough. A silence fell over the store. The men looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, shame, and a dawning, desperate hope. The woman they had pitied, the fool they had mocked, was now their sole chance of survival. Mr. Davies leaned heavily on his counter, his face pale. The memory of his own words, "You'll be back before the snow flies," hung in the air, a testament to his own short-sightedness. There was no grand apology, no dramatic scene of contrition. The situation was too dire for melodrama. A small delegation, led by the doctor and a shamefaced Mr. Davies, made the arduous trek up to the ridge the next day. They found Agnes splitting wood, Hattie beside her, clearing the snow from their path. They looked self-sufficient, strong, and completely unintimidated. Mr. Davies was the one to speak, his voice stripped of its usual condescending confidence. "Agnes," he said, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "Dr. Miller told us. The town is in need. We have nothing left." He didn't ask for charity. He knew he had no right. "We can pay. Come spring, whatever you need. Lumber, seed, tools, livestock. You name it." Agnes listened, her expression unreadable. She looked past him, at the other men, their faces etched with cold and desperation. She had every right to refuse, to hoard the resources she had so painstakingly gathered. But her system was built on foresight, and she saw a future beyond this winter. A future where she and Hattie were not outcasts, but part of a community. "There will be no payment," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the cold air. "Only trade. You'll keep a ledger, Mr. Davies. A fair accounting of what is taken. In the spring, the debt will be settled." It was a reversal of fortune so complete it was almost dizzying. She was now the creditor, the provider. She organized the rationing herself, doling out supplies with a firm but fair hand, ensuring every family got what they needed. Her desolate patch of rock became the heart of the town's survival, the flow of life-giving food moving down the mountain, a testament to the quiet, determined labor of a woman they had written off. The pity was gone, replaced by a deep, grudging, and ultimately profound respect. She was no longer the mad widow, she was Agnes, of the North Ridge.